So for this week's lab, I want to make sure you really understand how to work with cameras and animating cameras, but instead of just animating the camera like I did in class, I really want to show you how to rig the camera and set up a rig for the camera using a null object. This is going to really make your animations cleaner and a lot easier. And I want to kind of go through the process that you can use to create your kinetic typography. Hopefully it's going to help you with your project. I know that there are a lot of files and a lot of assets that you'll be working with. So I'm actually working with the rigging comp that I have here, and my comp settings are 1280 by 720, and I have just a solid black background. I'm going to say OK to that. I've organized all of my assets into folders because I'm working with so many different assets right now. So the first thing I will do is I will set my background. For my background, I have a grid graphic that I'm going to use, a grid comp that I'm going to use. So I'll bring that composition down. This is a really large composition, so please feel free if you want to use these to scale them in and out. Your grid that I may give you may be a different color. If it is, you can change that color by going to Effects, and easier just to look over here and going to the Fill effect. By using the Fill effect, you can change the color of that graphic. Since this is going to be my background, I'm not going to toggle the 3D space for it, but I will for all of my other elements. So let's start with our multiple elements pre-comp. We'll drag that down into our timeline, and it's above my grid so I can see it. So the first thing I want to do is go in and set the animations for all of the assets within this pre-comp. Okay, so now in my pre-comp, you can see I have all these different layers. This is where I would go in and I would animate the layers the way that I want them to appear. If I have audio with the layers, of course, I want my words to come in with the timing of the audio. I'm not going to work with audio right now, just to expedite this process so I can get to showing you how to rig a camera. So I'm going to set a couple animations here. I'm going to set an animation for the triangle ring. I'm going to set its Z rotation. I want to make sure that its anchor point is in the center, and it is. Make sure I'm at my first frame. Set my rotation for my Z. I'm going to come out about 14 frames. That'll work. And I want this to rotate multiple times, so I can keep pulling this so that it will rotate multiple times. I'm probably just gonna, it would be easier just to say, hey, I want you to rotate 3 times 180 degrees or 360. So you can see that it rotates 3 times around. So I want to set the rotation for my arrow. I will trigger my animation at the beginning of my timeline. I'll come out to about 12 or 14. But I want this to rotate in the opposite direction, so I could just drag and pull this so that it rotates in the opposite direction, or I can just come in and type -3. And that should work as well. There we go. Now the other thing I want to do in this comp is change my Z-axis. I can do that here, or I could do that in the main composition, which I think would be a little more difficult to do. I'm just going to do this numerically anyway. And I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to press P to get my position, and I'm just going to go in increments of 20. So I'll start with 20 for the first layer, select P, go to that Z position and change that to 40, select P, We will change that Z position to 80 and just keep going up until all of these layers have their Z position set. So I'm going to do that really quickly. Okay, so I have set all of the positions, Z positions for all of my layers. And I wanted you to notice, of course, to get to your Z position, remember you do have to toggle your 3D animation. And I, just for good practice, toggled my motion blur. So now I can go back to my main rigging comp, and I can see those rotation animations. Of course, I haven't changed my Z space, so I can't really see that as well. Okay, so next I will bring in another pre-comp. If you scrub through, you'll see I actually have some animation already for this other pre-comp. I just did that to expedite the process. You understand how to make simple animations of changing position or rotation. So finally, make sure you have toggled on your 3D visibility for both of your pre-comps. And let's move those into position. And here we need to think about, how do we want the camera to view these objects? I am going to move my first comp slightly off scene so that I can have my camera zoom into it. I'm actually going to scale this up a little bit because it seems a little small to me. So I'll just go into the scale here and scale it up. And before I actually move this into its position to prepare it for animating, I do want to point out that you need to toggle your collapse transform for the position changes to be visible in the Z axis. And a way I can illustrate this is I'm going to change to 2 camera views here on my horizontal. Let me scroll in. So this is the composition, my multiple elements comp. And if I'm looking at it from the top here, it just looks like one single layer. Well, we know that we've changed the positions of multiple layers in here, so that should be visible. To make that visible, we need to toggle right here, and you can immediately see that my multiple or my collapse transitions now have taken effect, so that all of the position changes that I made in my pre-comp are now visible in my main comp. Let's do that for the angular pi layer as well. We'll go back to one view and we'll position our pre-comps where we want them, and then we'll get our cameras animated. So I will move my first comp a little off scene, so we'll have our camera come in and swipe over, and then for our next composition I'll just have it a little bit over here so that maybe it'll come and swipe down. Because I of course have not toggled my animation for my grid, it'll stay my solid background and it will not change in Z space. So let's get ready to set our camera. First, go to Layer, New Camera, select OK. Let's go to Layer, New Null Object, which will act as our rig. And let's look at this from the top view one more time. So what you want to do when you set your camera, and really the best way to do this is using the top view, is to have your camera and your null object in the same facing the same way. So make sure your null object, of course, is 3D. But you want to make sure that they're centered exactly, because wherever this null object is going to go is where your camera's face will go. It's very important that they're aligned. So if your null object was over here and you rigged your camera to it, when you would orbit or do any rotations, you would get wide swinging rotations. Maybe not what you would expect. So to make these aligned, you can move your null object to the center of your camera, and really the best way to do this is to select your camera and zoom in and set the camera's anchor point, which is right here, to the center of your null object. We'll select our anchor point tool. I will move that to the center of my null object. Now I will select my null object and I will move its anchor point to the center. So our anchor points will be matching. Now when looking at this from the top view, you can see that right here this little box represents the camera body, so to speak, and this triangle represents its vantage point. This is what you can see on screen. Let's go back to our single view here and get ready to animate our null object, which is our rig. So let's set our position for our null object. Move over a few seconds. Set another keyframe, and what I want to have happen is this camera to reveal the pre-comp that I have here, so it'll just swipe over. And I can just drag that over, and you can see now it reveals. And I can add, interesting. I could make it a straight line, or I could click in here and add a keyframe. If I wanted to add some interest, like maybe it swipes up a little bit. And remember, we were talking about interpolation, so you have those options to work with. For now, I'm happy with that. Now I want to animate my camera rotating. And I'm not going to animate my camera, of course. I'm going to animate my null object. So now I want to animate my camera rotating. So I want to animate my Y rotation. So I'm going to toggle that animation, move out a few frames, and just change that Y rotation. And maybe I'll have it come and snap back to 0. Let's type in 0. So let's render this. We've got our camera swiping in. We've got a nice rotation where it snaps back. And now we need to reveal our second comp. So we need to animate the position of our null object once again. So I'm going to set a keyframe. Move out. Set another keyframe. And I can just simply drag my null object to reveal my second composition. So let's do a quick render. So maybe I want to do a rotation again when I land on the second pre-comp. So let's add another keyframe for my Y rotation. Move out a few seconds, and we'll just go in the opposite direction. And then we'll have that snap back. As well, back to 0. Now when I RAM preview this, it's not so bad, but it's going to be really important that I change some of the interpolation on some of these keyframes so that there's not such hard jerky animations. So we want to add some easy ease in and ease out. So here I believe I will add in a, go to keyframe assistance, and I'll add a ease out. Let's add an easy ease to this keyframe. And you know, this is going to be a preference for your animation. I think I'm going to add an easy ease to this final position keyframe, and I want to add a ease out. There we go. So it feels like it bounces back and it's not such a hard. So you'll go, with your animation, you'll go and figure out what works best for what you're trying to accomplish. But this is really the best way and the best practice for animating, in my opinion, kinetic typographies or any other 2D graphics, especially when dealing with a camera in 3D space. There's only one other effect I'd like to show you that I think could enhance some of your animations, and that is actually animating the depth of field of your camera itself. So let's position, here we go, let's position our animation so that we can see where this is like rotating at us, where it's the closest to the camera. Let's select our camera, open up camera options, and turn on depth of field. Okay. So when you have your depth of field on, really the only two things that you're going to change are your focus distance and your aperture. If you crank up your focus distance, this is going to open up how much you can actually see. So let me bring this down really low. I'll bring it down to 0. So my focus distance is 0, so I can see nothing. So this is going to determine how much I can see. I want to crank this up so we can, of course, see all of the animation. I'm at about 200. But the aperture is what's going to give us that depth of field effect. Let me crank up my aperture. And now you can see I have some blurriness. But you can see everything's blurry. And everything's blurry because my focal distance or focus distance here is not very large. If I increase that, you can begin to see that things in the background become a little crisper. And let me bring my aperture down just a little bit. Not that far. And as you can see, when I bring that aperture up, I'm at about 50 here, and I have a focus distance of 600 or 620, you can see that the things in the foreground are blurry, while the things in the background remain crisp. So let's scrub through this animation. So let's do a RAM preview of the animation. And I want you to keep in mind you can animate the depth of field if you would like, and set keyframes for it, but you do not have to. So I get this nice blurry effect for things that are close to the camera, and then they come back into focus. Let me RAM preview this one more time with our grid turned off. There we go. Okay, let's play through the animation at full speed. One thing I did want to note here, you can see some nice depth of field where things are very crisp. Certain items in the foreground are crisp, where as they get further off, you're getting a little more blur to your assets. So animating or just changing and turning on depth of field adds some really nice effects to your animation. Hopefully this will help you with your kinetic typography project, just to give you a process and a workflow that I would use to accomplish this task.